Hello, everyone. So welcome to tonight's discussion, which is about These Pages Fall Like Ash. And the discussion is called Immersive Storytelling Between Two Worlds. So the shape of the discussion tonight is going to go like this. We're going to show a short video about the project as it was back in 2013. And then we'll move forward in time to discuss the new iteration of this important work. So we'll talk about how it was made in 2013 and why it's been remade in 2020. Yeah, that's when we are. We'll have a discussion between the four of us to talk about various issues and how it was made. And then from around 7:30, we'll open up to questions from the audience. So please, as I said, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the Q&A box. If you put it into chat by mistake, don't worry, we've got somebody who's going to cut and paste it and put it into the Q&A box. So let's start by sharing the film. Over to you, DCRC.
I'm Tom Abba. My role on this project is the academic partner, so I'm really bringing 10 years of research into narrative theory and how story works on digital platforms.
I'm Duncan Speakman, and I'm a director of Circumstance, and we're one of the co-creators of These Pages Fall Like Ash.
These Pages Fall Like Ash is a story told across two books. One is a beautiful crafted physical object. The other book, if we can call it a book, is digital text hidden on hard drives across the city you live in. The way we've described it is two cities, each overlapping the other, streets that border two worlds, two people who can no longer remember the other's existence. And that over a 2.5-week experiential story, our readers will come to know the characters we've created, come to know this other city that is existing alongside their own, and come to realize what impact that has on their lives, and hopefully make them see their own city a little differently. You'll start with a physical notebook, actually two physical notebooks bound inside a wooden case. One notebook is a guide to this other city, one notebook is a partly unwritten guide to your own city. Those notebooks have a map in them, and you'll go from that map to find real locations across Bristol. And those locations exist in both worlds. And what you'll do within that is you'll use your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop to log into local networks, local offline wireless networks, and you'll find digital content. And that digital content will be the chapters of a story. Together they'll form your guide to a story you'll experience as you work your way through it.
It became an experiment in how can we make something that isn't just two projects around one book, or it's a kind of digital book and a physical book, but how do we make something where one is dependent on the other and you can't have one without the other?
We had creative consultancy from Nick Harkaway and Neil Gaiman. They essentially took our outline, rewrote it, made it better, and then gave it back to us.
We've played with a few kind of little interactive touches and little things that are unique to what you can do with text on the screen and text in a browser. But we've tried to be quite subtle with those. We don't want to go overboard with them. It's not about the novelty of sort of touchscreens or anything like that.
We've kept reading as a you and the thing in front of you experience as something quite personal and quite singular, but we've really tried to engage with the manner of that in a public space, in a cafe, when you're reading on a digital device that's not a book. People look around them when they read, but asking people to look up and look down from a tablet or from a smartphone means that your engagement with the world around you becomes part of your reading experience itself. We're going to ask people to write, to photograph, to record things about their own lives, and what they tell us will be part of the end of the story.
one of the big questions for us in this is, how do you make the physical book valuable again? And we know we can do that by making a sort of beautiful object, but we also wanted to find out if there was a way to make the story expand out of the pages of the book, so that your digital experience is not just a marketing experience, it's not something that just gives you more background on the author or on the history of the project, but it's actually whether you can tell a story that goes across both platforms. What's important for us is to find those writers who are interested in opening out the story space and interested in where can we take the idea of story that moves beyond the page, not just adding to something that's already written, but writing together and writing an experience and a story together.
Thank you. Beautiful film. Who made the film? Do we know?
That was Benji Croak, I think. Yeah.
Right, yeah, beautifully made. Yeah, thanks,
The
Tom.
ones for Ambient Lit Cape.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to kick off by just doing short introductions of everyone, and then we'll move into some conversation. So so I'm Kate Pullinger. I'm a writer. I write novels, and I also collaborate with technologists to create works of digital media. I worked with Duncan Speakman and Tom Abba, who you see here tonight, among other people, on a project called Ambient Literature, where we worked on situated works for the smartphone. Tom, who you can see in one of your screens, Tom Abba is a writer and artist whose practice addresses the form and content of both digital and physical books, alongside hybrid forms of the two. He's Associate Professor of Art and Design at UWE Bristol, and since 2016 has worked on the Ambient Literature Research Project, exploring the potential of digitally mediated situated storytelling. Duncan Speakman, who now has a beard. That's my only view of beardless Duncan was the film. So there's Duncan in one of your corners of the screen, is a composer and sound artist. He creates narrative sound-led experiences that engage audiences in uncontrolled public and private space. He regularly creates bespoke work internationally, including installations on trains in China, loudspeaker symphonies in New Zealand, audio walks in Saitama, and sound installations in Porto. And we also have with us tonight Nick Harkaway. Nick is the author of Gnomon, as well as The Gone Away World, Angel Maker, and Tiger Man. The Blind Giant, Being Human in a Digital World, is his full-length nonfiction work, which examined the interaction of technology and humanity and how best to live in a world where gadgets have become fundamental. So hopefully we'll talk about those ideas as well. So just to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on that. But we're going to start by returning to 2013 and the film that we've just seen, and a question for Duncan, really initially, but hopefully to hear from all three of you on this, which was, what was the impetus behind the creation of this work in 2013, and how was it made?
So thanks, Kate, for the introductions. It has a sort of genus, I guess, a couple of years before 2013, I'd been making different forms of audio walks for quite a long time, usually fictional works that would guide people through cities. And I'd moved to Belgium with the intention of doing a sort of collection of audio walks with a sort of some kind of book or catalogue together with them. And Tom, at the same moment, Tom, and for those who know him, this might be a surprise to you, but he was ranting on Twitter about some publishing innovation that had been made, where they were going to put music soundtracks alongside existing books. And sort of in response to Tom's rant that this was terrible, I was like, well, you know, it could be good if you wrote the book knowing that that's what's going to happen, you know, and why don't we try doing that? So Tom came over to Belgium, and we made a short piece that kind of did that. That was written as something that combined an audio experience for a location. I think it was for a cafe. I think was the original plan, actually. And a written narrative story in print in a physical book that went with a collection. And so then about 2 years later, I might be slightly wrong on the times here, the React Books and Print project came up, looking for projects that were researching the future of the book. And Tom had this idea around dead drops, these sort of hard drives that were hidden around cities containing data, and whether you could sort of make a narrative that kind of used that. So we came together again on that to kind of go back to this idea of, well, what happens when you tie narratives to physical location? And it was actually only through the process of working on the project during React that we got to this sort of physical book and digital content connection, which my memory, we had a quick sort of catch up about this yesterday, was that we had this idea that we'd give people notebooks to sort of, so that they'd be kind of writing their own physical book alongside the digital content. And that sort of spiraled out into, well, why can't we also have a story in the printed book? And how can that story relate to this digital content that's sort of embedded into the world through physical hard drives? I think,
Yeah,
Tom, is there something you want to?
No, it's fine. That was it was a really organic thing, wasn't it? In that sense that React, just for anybody who didn't know, it was a kind of publicly funded project that Watershed in Bristol hosted with 4 universities. But we officially had 3 months. I think we took 5 to go from initial idea to prototype. So it was a sprint, and just to give Nick justification for being in the room. One of the things that we wanted to do, which is kind of there, it was there in the video, was we wanted writers in the room. We were kind of very aware that we might fall in love with the mechanical or technology or some aspect of the situatedness, and we wanted to be reminded that we were trying to tell a story. And so yeah, Neil and Nick came on board as kind of creative consultants. Actually, then there was a story about this very, very late in the day.
Yeah, I should also acknowledge that Emilie Grenier, who can't be here tonight, was also worked on an early stage. She's a sort of interactive narrative designer as well, who'd worked with me on some audio walks and had a kind of interactive narrative sort of background. So she also came in to help to kind of develop the stories and the structure for it.
Many of her words are still in the final draft.
So Nick, you were brought on board kind of as a kind of narrative consultant, really. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, Tom kind of got in touch with me and said, we're doing this crazy thing. And obviously it's right up your street, and you have much to contribute. And I thought, it sounds absolutely amazing. I think I will probably be completely useless, but I was excited by it. So I said, yes, absolutely. I can absolutely help with that. I have many thoughts about that, which is what authors say when you ask them to do anything. Yes, I have thoughts about that. I mean, you know this, right? I mean, so yeah, I went along, and it was amazing, and the judgment call that they made was right. They did need us, kind of Neil was sitting there being kind of sporadically brilliant in the background, kind of leafing through things and just tossing out these kind of wild kind of notions which would blow everything up and make it all start again. And I was sitting there kind of scribbling everything down, going, right, okay, and how is that going to fit together? But it was, Tom in the video kind of, he says, that we took it away from them, and we kind of imposed the structure and gave it back to them. I honestly believe to this day they did all the work. We came in and kind of contributed in kind of wild and random ways, and then left them with this kind of pile of broken furniture, which they proceeded to turn into an artwork. And
Nick, had you been involved with creating any kind of digitally mediated works before then?
I'm kind of by origin sort of cross media anyway, because I was a film writer in a very unsuccessful way, and I have some film chops just from short films and so on. And then I don't think I had done anything in the digital space in that mode, but I had been very loud-mouthed for 5 years about publishing's timidness in the digital sphere, and could we not do something in advance of Google, Apple, or Amazon doing it? Rather than running to catch up and then have them just innovate and turn the corner on us and suddenly we're running to catch up again. And I think that was probably how Tom and I knew each other in the first place, was a kind of general frustrated background noise.
Sort of rantiness.
The rantiness about the failings of publishing to consider the future of innovation.
Failings is a harsh word.
Inherent conservativeness.
Yes, lack of desire to innovate in their own space.
Yeah.
Which I think probably remains true. It's kind of settled, but it's still there.
Yeah. Tom, do you have anything that you want to add to talking about that process back in 2013?
No, I mean, just to kind of underscore what Duncan said, is that I think weirdly, Duncan, in front of me, there is a notebook that dates from Christmas 2012, which has the first original title for this before we got started, which I may share at some point. But it was kind of iterative and grew and went in. One of the joyous things, so I'm going to wax lyrical about React, was React funded a cohort of projects. So we weren't on our own. We weren't kind of like sequestered away doing this. We had to come together with other people. And that bit of exposing your ideas was incredibly useful. And we sort of, my recollection, Duncan, is we went in leaps and bounds. There would be a few days where it was difficult to get anything done and difficult to kind of see your way beyond something. But then suddenly this kind of hothouse thing happened, and it would challenge you and scare you in a way, but then you'd go off and do 3 weeks work in 2 days. And that was, I'm still a firm believer. And actually, sorry, and this is the thing about Duncan, but Duncan's kind of work process still scares me. When I went to Belgium that first weekend, I got off the train and Duncan met me, and we took the train up to Ghent, and I had visions of I'm going to be sitting drinking gin and a beer, and maybe we'll talk about a project and we'll start working on maybe Saturday afternoon. No, 2 hours we were out following people around Ghent with recorded sound playing through headphones in the freezing cold. That he worked incredibly quickly, and that made me work quickly as well. That this was a sprint to something.
Were you already familiar with that kind of stuff with Duncan's work at the time? Had you done it before? Sorry, Duncan.
We talked together at UE about 3-4 years before that, and
I'd had Tom look at narrative structures on a sort of mass participation audio walk I'd done. Actually, I feel like I think I had you look at.
You did. I can't remember which one it was.
Yeah, I think something to say about that iterative process with this stuff. I think Tom's really right that one of the things that happened in React was that sort of, we could just keep throwing ideas out to a cohort of people who were all thinking in this about these questions. And normally, I think I would anyway, and I think what Tom's talking about in our early work, this sort of iteration of trying things out very rapidly. With this one, there wasn't as much trying out in the iterations, because we were just we didn't know what it was we were going to be trying out. So actually those early iterations of throwing ideas out were kind of, here's an idea for a form and a story, and we'd get feedback on that really quickly, and we could sort of try out ideas ourselves very quickly. But actually, yeah, getting that feedback is probably what led to the physical book, and making this ungodly technical nightmare for ourselves.
I mean, on my first day, the thing that was transformative for me when I kind of came in, I was like, okay, I will bend my mind to this, whatever it is. And, not kidding around, you guys are going to get the best I had, whatever it was. The thing that was transformative was we did the audio walk, I think, that you made around the Soho Theatre. And I'd never done anything like it. And I was immediately like, okay, this is a vastly powerful medium that I know nothing about, but it has commonalities with things I do know about. But I was just like, okay, this is a very powerful way of creating a non-existent overlay, or in the real world, and it's massively interesting. And you had a very interesting physical trick, which was to make the person hand over an item of worth to somebody who was doing the walk at the same time, so that your soul is already split. As you're walking around, you have an investment in the other person, and you're really paying attention, which is, again, is very powerful. And it's I was kind of like, okay, there are things here that we can do that I have never considered, which are going to be very forceful in evoking an emotional response, which is, you know, kind of part of what I felt I was there for.
Grabbing people's attention. That's a really interesting way of putting it, Nick. Duncan, I wanted just to, before we move on to the new version of these pages, there was something that you said right at the beginning of the discussion about the project in the cafe. Did you say that it was also a book digital hybrid project? So Duncan, have you always, you know, I think of you as a sound person, as a composer. Have you always been attracted to the form of the book as well? And it seems like that's like a decade of experimenting with the book as well as with the digital. Is that correct?
Vaguely. I did some of the audio walks I made sort of in this kind of mid 2000s would sometimes have an associated piece of print with them that would be, sometimes they were sort of a map guide, sometimes they were kind of contextual prompts for things. I did a residency in Banff and they had an amazing library of artist books, and I got a bit obsessed with that, the tangible object in relation to the kind of ephemeral audio, and so I did go through a period of kind of making these things, but not really in this kind of interdependence that I guess we were looking for. I think the piece that me and Tom made was probably the one in the cafe was probably the first piece where it was they kind of had to go together in a way. The content in the book really sort of fed into the narrative that you were listening to.
And Nick, had that been something that you thought about at all, potential relationships between books and digital, or the book as a hybrid object?
I think at that time, I'm pretty sure I had an obsession, which I still have, which is I'm horrified by the forms of digital book readers. I think they're boring and ugly, and I don't understand why anybody would want one. I mean, obviously, you know, I understand because they contain books, but it drives me crazy that they don't look beautiful and that they don't feel beautiful, physically, tactilely feel beautiful. So I absolutely did have that. Weirdly, whether it's because I'm quite conservative in that particular space or not, it hadn't really occurred to me to experiment with the form of what I do in connection with that perception. Or possibly it's because I want technologies which are not yet even kind of imaginable. I was actually thinking about this. I was thinking about the magic ebook reader that I want, and I want almost like a kind of pot of goo you can reach into and pull up and just stretch it out. It has the words on the page, you know. Or, I mean, so I just kind of, but this was the first time that I began to think in those terms.
Okay, Duncan.
Just a thought about that one of the, I think we were also trying to address that same issue, but sort of did it the other way by going, well, we can't build a fancy ebook reader. So we really wanted people to be able to do it on the devices they already had, you know, that they could do it on their phones that they had in their pockets, and it would just be a web interface. And so that the object itself could then be the beautiful thing. But quite importantly, although we weren't changing the physical form of the objects people held, one of the things in the original version, which I'm still really like excited by, I think it's something that I really liked, was that when you connected to our hard drives, I don't know how clear it is in the video, but these hard drives were stored around the city and they were Wi-Fi enabled. When you connected to that Wi-Fi network, you weren't connected to the internet anymore. So that your device that you kind of used to connect to everything else was suddenly locked into this other world, for want of a better thing. You know, it was locked into the world of our narrative. So although we weren't physically changing the device, there was this little sense for me that we were making the device somehow magical because it was accessing something that nothing else, it didn't normally access in a way.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So Tom, can you talk a bit about this new version?
Yeah, sure. So
the new version of these pages fall like ash, and you know, including the how and the why.
Kind of like, yeah. I mean, the how kind of goes back 5 years, weirdly. I mean, one of the things that Duncan and I wanted to do when we finished the first version was kind of done out. We took a breath and we talked about what we hadn't been able to do. And one of the things we hadn't been able to do was the first version was fixed to Bristol. And, you know, it was run on Raspberry Pis. It was really kind of experimental. And although it taught us a lot, it taught me a lot, I think one of the things we were really keen to do is how can you take that and make it run anywhere? And not only technically, but poetically. Is how do you think about that sense of relationship to presence, to where you are, and make that somehow applicable to somebody in New York or in Berlin or in Bristol, and still have a kind of an attachment to the narrative. So we spent maybe about 4 or 5 months thinking that through, and at the same time had some money that was a kind of follow-on from React. So the book you've got in your hand, Kate, was printed in 2015. That we just spent the money and printed them, and they've been sat under my stairs for 5 years. And so, because in the meantime, as you and I know, ambient literature came along, and our first instinct was it was too soon after the first version to release it. And then ambient lit came along and sort of derailed everything for a couple of years. And then my honest answer is I had a dream. I had a dream in May. I had one of those kind of weird pandemic anxious dreams about, not bleak, but kind of my brain was kind of whirring something over. And in it, These Pages Fall Like Ash was out. And I kind of woke up and had coffee and thought nothing, I mean, that was odd and interesting, and it was out in the world and it was there. And then about 3 days later, an architect called Sam Davey rang me up. And he rang me because, the full story, Sam rang me because he found a number in his phone and he wasn't sure what it was or who it was. So he rang this kind of phone number and got me. And Sam illustrated the second edition. So we had this kind of conversation about, oh, what are you doing now? And did we ever do that? And we didn't. And then that kind of lodged a thing in my head that when two events occur independently connected to the same object of inquiry, one was Place Detention Agent Cooper. And it suddenly became this really evident thing that in May, the rhetoric from government was we're going to be coming out of lockdown at some point. You know, we kind of gone through the first month or two, and it felt, from my point of view, that to put a piece of work out in the world that didn't require you to be with anybody else, that you could choose the route you walked, was somehow both kind of responsible to not quite knowing what the world would look like in a couple of months' time. But also, one of the things I was really keen on in the first version, I remember moving to Bristol in 1992 and being really struck by, I've grown up for 20 years in Grimsby in the north, or the Midlands east of England, and I didn't know anything in Bristol. I didn't know where alleyways went, where streets went, and I wanted that sense of wonderment to kind of come back. And so that feeling of whenever we came out of lockdown, that there would be a space in which we might see the world differently, felt like an opportunity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the work also kind of builds, the new iteration of the work also builds on, of course, or sits alongside the work that Duncan did on It Must Have Been Dark by Then. And this idea of using, which I think is a really fruitful idea, of using geolocation without actually tying you to a specific location. That's something that was explored more in ambient literature as well. So is that correct, Tom? Is that the correct way of thinking about it?
I think that is. I think Duncan is closer to that bit of it in that instance, that he's taken that more, or in different directions than I have necessarily. I kind of feel like I'm revisiting a work from 5 years ago and sprucing it up and making it work. And actually a shout out should go to Josh Connor, who rebuilt the whole back end of it in kind of record time without swearing at me once. That we just said, we need this doing and it needs to work, because the version we'd had built, which was elegant, was bolted together from 4 or 5 different systems. And Josh remade it. I think that's true. I mean, my feeling is certainly during ambient lit is we were kind of leapfrogging back and forward with some old ideas and new technologies and ways to do it. Suddenly there will be a new way of doing something because the technology hadn't enabled us to do that. And I'm thinking of things like Breathe in that respect, Kate, in terms of using, say, APIs and using kind of contextual data around you wasn't something that we could have done 8 years before.
No, absolutely.
That kind of like we're leapfrogging back and forth in a really weird, interesting way, and that old ideas get repurposed and get brought out, and you never even knew they were an old idea necessarily, but they suddenly find a new life.
Well, that's true of the book itself, isn't it? Continually reimagined. But and just in case people don't have the book, there's the print book, but the print book has a relationship to the story. There's a digital iteration of the story that the book interacts with, so to speak.
That's probably a quite elegant way of describing it. Yeah,
which also has amazing illustrations that we didn't have the first time around. Tam, who actually came and experienced the work, like the first version of the work, said, I like this, I'd like to do some illustrations for it. I think that's the right one.
That was pretty much, yeah.
And so the illustrated version of the book, the new one, which is these amazing illustrations, they were sort of inspired by the work itself, which I kind of like as a sort of constantly evolving work.
Well, I think that leads nicely to this first question that we've got here in the Q&A. I'll click on answer live. I don't know what'll happen when I. Okay, now. So
you're going to answer it, Kate.
No.
I have a response. This is the question about urban context.
Yeah. So the majority of projects that plant at least one foot in the digital tend to assume that urban as a context. So that the question should be there for everyone to read, but it is really interesting in light of what we're talking about in terms of works that directly map onto public space in some way, and the kind of politics around that, which is something that we've tried to explore in the ambient literature book. So Duncan, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, I do actually, because there's two interesting things there. One is historically, early locative media works actually didn't happen in urban environments. Early pieces, some of Terry Rube's pieces happen in woodland trails. I think Janet Cardiff's first audio walk was in Banff in the woods. I might be mistaken on that. So there was a kind of tendency of just where people were doing residencies and to experimenting with work. For me, and this is going to involve some massively sweeping statements, so I apologize. The reason I make work in urban context is because I'm trying to make works that encourage people to engage with their immediate environment, both the physical, social, political environment around them, in a way that they've sort of distanced, that I think they've quite often distanced themselves from. I think if you live in rural contexts, you're quite often already quite engaged with your physical environment and your social environment. So there's not a problem there that I'm trying to address. So the work I'm making, it's not urban because of the technology, it's urban because that's where I see the problems that I'm trying to make. And I think there's massive potential for all these projects to work in rural environments if your content and your kind of narrative is responding to that. That's my take.
Yeah,
I apologize to anyone who feels really isolated and hating their neighbours in rural environments as well.
Yeah, I mean, building on the content thing, for me, and sorry to be an academic, it's about the relationship between form and content. And the form, one of the things that I've been trying to do since and before these pages is to think about what the form of the thing is that we're making. So, you know, in this instance, what's the equivalent of a chapter? What's the equivalent of, how do we play with narrative voice in those spaces? How does tension work? I think when we spoke a day or so, Nick remarked that one of the things that you felt you'd been brought in for, I think Duncan said it as well, was to persuade people to turn the next page.
Yes.
Was that sense of narrative impetus that I think you and Neil did do for us in that respect, and get reminded as of that there's an importance in that. But I think one of the things that I've been trying to do personally is to figure out what that form looks like, and then that form is shaped by the content of the story you want to tell. So you break bits of it and you turn it on its head and you think about how does that relate technologically or materially or haptically, or just a kind of bridge onto the next question, in a sense about your sense of presence in a space or your relationship to a particular space, and that then opens things out. I'd love to, just because where my head is, I'd love to do a folk horror situated piece, just with English landscape. Mm-hmm.
And Nick, how does that relate to the fictional worlds you create? So moving away from the kind of urban rural to this kind of sense of story worlds and other worlds, does that speak to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I'm constantly, I think, messing around with the idea of an invisible underlayer. And so obviously when I think about it, when I look back at these pages Fall Like Ash, I think, well, it's absolutely about that. It's about showing, it's like, it occurred to me yesterday, it's like the button in the word processor that I use, which has a reveal codes button, and you can suddenly see all the formatting. You're seeing the answer to the mystery, or you're seeing the mystery. This was one of the things I think that came up when we were doing this, and absolutely, I think the thing that kind of the moment that I felt we were actually needed in the room, or that I was when Duncan said, yeah, but how do we get people to go from one section of this story to the next? And I was like, that's what I do all the time. I live with the fear that the reader won't turn the page, and there's kind of fairly obvious toolkit for dealing with that, and the classic one is the sort of, I can't do the exact quote, but it's, you have someone come through the door with a gun, and you can absolutely do that. You prompt people to go to the next thing with mystery, with emotional engagement, with cliffhangers. I mean, there are different tools to make that happen. But kind of, yeah, this notion of discovering the invisible, it has absolutely kind of carried on through everything I've done since then. I mean, just, and more really, because I think it's the experience. And I like also the kind of, the tactility versus the intangibility that's going on. The creation of this amazing book, the kind of the wooden object that we saw in the video, which is, apart from anything else, it's physically rough to touch. Sorry, I'm doing this with my hands down here and you can't see. Physically rough to touch. And so it's a very strong tactile signal. And yet you're interfacing with something which obviously is not. And it's actually, just while we're talking about this, we're talking about the kind of rural element to it. Where I come from down in Cornwall, you still can't get never mind a 4G signal. You can't get any kind of data signal at all. And so it struck me suddenly that it might be possible to do something where the narrative is triggered by a movement from somewhere where you have cell phone signal to somewhere where you don't. And actually the thing that you would do with that, it's quite interesting. You'd be investigating the holes in the world or whatever. It's these things kind of, and this was the experience that we had when we were working on this, even just for the brief time that I was there, was someone would say something like that and someone else would go, ooh, ooh. And then, you're kind of kicking off again into this thing. And that's kind of why I say that Neil and I left Tom and Duncan and Emilie with like kind of a pile of broken furniture. I mean, that's not strictly true. I mean, I kind of culled it all together, but it was a very, very rough outline. And the thing is that they were then the people, because they had the technological expertise and the artistic expertise with a medium that we didn't, they were then going to have to find out for example, which cues they wanted to use to drive people from one chapter to the next. Because, we couldn't predict that. If you're going to use a sound cue or, the intricacies of what they were doing, the interaction between the physical, the digital, the book, and so on, that was all going to be down to them.
Great. Yeah, they're really, really interesting. Please, if you've got questions, put them into the click on the Q&A somewhere on your screen. It's on the bottom of my screen, and put your question into the Q&A. But we've got another question here, which is from Sarah Huxley. Could you speak more as to how the project stretches your understanding of presence? So Duncan, why don't you start that off?
Yeah, that's quite a tough one. Well, it's interesting. I think I've shifted my language around presence for a while. There was a period when people were talking about everything being immersive, and it was sort of, the early days of sort of Punch Drunk being very successful and immersive theatre being the rage. And so audio walks and these kind of experiences were constantly referred to as being immersive. And I really sort of pushed back against this, because for me, it wasn't about immersing you in the content. It was about making you present in the world. I guess I'm slightly shifting my sense on that at the moment, that I think a notion of immersion of immersive media, of an immersive experience, is something that exposes what you're already immersed in, whether that's ecological environments, Wi-Fi networks, and in that way, that kind of makes you present. Yeah,
Tom?
yeah, I don't know, Tom. Maybe you have a better take. I don't know whether I don't know whether the project stretches my idea of presence. Rather, it just asks people to be more present.
I think
It is one of the, when we were working on ambient literature, one of our definitions that we produced talked about how the works interacted with the presence of the reader. So there's that sense of presence really in these works, isn't it? Which is the reader or the user or the player. Tom.
Okay, you said player, Kate. My hackles have gone up. I think no. While Duncan was talking, I was thinking about something that he and I talked about when we made Short Films for You. Was the piece we talked about, that Duncan talked about, that we made in sort of end of 2011, 2012. That actually I think is true for all the stuff that we've made together. And I think actually it's not quite there in James Attlee's piece for Ambient Lit, in that you're not playing a character, you're you. And it was something that Duncan and I talked about, and it's not something we ever said we'd never do something where you're a character, but it always felt richer, that we ask you to respond as you. We're not asking you to, the performance is a very small p. You're performing because you're enacting and you're responding to a space. You're not performing a character. We're not asking you to kind of expose yourself in that regard and to open that bit out. And I think that sense that we don't try and place you within a story as a character. The story happens around you. You're an observer, but you're not passive. You are active. In this case of these pages, the thing doesn't open up until you walk the streets, and you walk and you decide where your cafe is and where your intersection is and where your things are. And for me, that there's a clumsy bit in my head about when I'm thinking about what these things look like. Okay, in relation to a book is a thing that exists, and yes, a book doesn't really have a kind of significance until it's read, and everybody takes something different away from a book. These things, for me at least, are a collection of different things that have got kind of emotional and conceptual triggers inside them. But that what someone brings to that is, to my mind, there's much more potential there, just from an unknown potential, than there is for me when I write a piece of prose. And that's just me.
I've got just a very quick thought before we maybe go on to the next question, which is one of the things we did in the original book as a thing, slightly inspired by people like Kerry Smith and her Wreck This Journal things, was the book asks you to make a mark in it. So you've got these kind of two parts in the original book. In the new book, it's inverted half of the book. One of the first things it asks you to do is for you to put a mark on the page. And that was a very active choice to kind of say, okay, this is a printed book. This is what we're talking about as a publication that you'd get, but we were trying to very actively say it's incomplete, and your actions on the page and you sort of making notes, you tearing it, you damaging it, is kind of part of the work. And so there's a sense of presence in that, I think, that whereas the normal format of a book, and I think that's what Kerry Smith does really well, the normal format of a book is that you read it and it's there and it's sacrosanct, but yeah. We're kind of saying, no, you're in this, and it might just be through markings, but we're actively asking you to do that. That was just a thought about something about presence in the work.
And Nick, does that question bring anything to mind for you about presence in this piece?
So much. Yes. Okay. So to me, it triggers a discussion about pattern and presence, which is a juxtaposition everyone was very keen on for a while, and I'm sort of still very interested in. Obviously, in the context of these pages, you have a pattern that lies behind the world, which is invisible, which is the story, and the pattern of the world, but you also have the presence of the book, and you're using the book as a gateway to access the alternative pattern as the real world. There's a whole discussion about authenticity in relation to our digital devices, and it's something that I feel because in the vein of it not being sufficiently tactile, a digital reading device not being sufficiently tactile. and you get sort of Coetzee and Auster in their dialogues, which they conducted by fax. What's that? Coetzee says, I admire you very much for giving your characters access to cell phones because I think they damage the human drama. And Auster just says, well, I mean, they don't. But, you know, I find that extraordinary, because I think the presumption that you can have an authentic 20th or 21st century human experience without access to the relevant technologies that shape those worlds is very strange. And so here you have the, I mean, actually what's happening with pattern and presence, I think, is more that they are collapsing into one another and fusing. And so these pages is very predictive of that. And that goes through, I mean, you know, I wrote about sort of clockwork and steam engines and so on in my second book, and you know, then I got into simulations and so on in Gnomon, and the new book is about biotech and biology, and again about patterns and presence and whether you're present and so on. So I feel that kind of that thing very, very strongly. But I'm intrigued by the authenticity point in this moment. I'm just fascinated by how these pages and projects like it maybe are partly about teaching us that authenticity exists where we are, not as something that you have to seek out in some kind of primal human mud.
Great, thank you. Really interesting responses. So the next question there, if you were to start again now, would you change anything?
Everything.
Question.
Always.
Yeah.
Yeah, always.
I think we have. I mean, I think some of the things in the new one have addressed some of the things we wanted to change. What for me, the biggest change would from that has happened is I'd make it smaller. Like one of I don't quite. It sort of spiraled out of control, the first one, and became this epic work. And I don't mean epic in the terms of you know, Lord of the Rings or something. It was epic in terms of the physical commitment that we were asking of the reader, because you're not just a reader, you're a walker and you're a mover through the environment, and it, you know, it had a fixed timing to it where we only released new content on our schedule. You know, I think was it every week? I can't even remember now. It was about every week a new episode came out. And if you had to go back to the places we'd picked in Bristol that might be a long way from where you lived or whatever, you know, we asked a lot of you. And in the new version, it's slightly constrained in a couple of ways. One, there's a reduction in the way the chapters are positioned, so there's not as many locations, and you get to choose what the interval is that things are released at, and you get to choose the locations. There's still issues around composition in that way for me, which I'm still trying to unpack in all my work, which is around, as soon as you introduce movement and different locations, you introduce time and gaps that are still somehow part of the experience, and how do you manage that? But yeah, that's I think some of the things we have changed, but there's probably a general constriction of it maybe.
I'm aware more when I went back through the thing when we were putting back out early this summer of how much really almost kind of over world building there is in the book, to my mind, in both sides, and it felt like that's a 2013 me and a 2014-15 me of trying to justify why the print version is a print version, or the print thing is the print thing. I still love it, and I think Sam did a beautiful job, but there's about 20% too much at least in that kind of overlays it. But that's
free bargain for the readers.
It is a bargain, yeah. But I guess
20% free world building.
You did talk about, so the next question is about the lockdown, somebody who's in the strict lockdown in Melbourne. You did talk about that briefly, Tom, didn't you, about thinking about COVID and this new version?
We thought about it, and that in a way was I remember being quite, I wasn't nervous, I was quite apprehensive in that when I got in touch with Duncan and said, and my thing was, you know, he and I hadn't spoken, well, I suppose it sounds so tired, but because of lockdown, we'd seen each other for a month or two, and I kind of got in touch with that kind of, I think we should put this out again, or we should get this put out. And I was quite prepared, partly because Duncan's work has evolved over the last, and both of our works have evolved over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, that might be a thing you didn't want to do. And I was really pleased that you did in that respect. It was kind of, no, we should do this absolutely and get it out. to answer that particular point from Paul, one of the really interesting things that I found when, and this is in August when we announced it, is, and I completely had not cottoned onto this. I was getting questions on Twitter and questions by email and questions just not massively, but a number of different channels from people, mostly in the States, who were really unsure about how they responded to their own environment. And what they understood what the piece was, they understood what they were being asked, that if they bought this, what they'd be asked to do. But there was an awful lot, the only way I can describe it is hand holding. And it made me kind of really aware, I mean, you know, the world has changed in the last week, but really aware that America is a very big place, and however much in the UK we've had a very odd experience of the way lockdown has been administered and the way COVID has been handled. Actually, America is vaster. And that real sense that I got of people being scared, people being worried about the world outside in a kind of, in a pandemic apocalypse manner, that, you know, will I be asked, the basic question, will I be asked to go somewhere I'm not comfortable with? And that for me was a real, it only lasted a week or so in that first run, that first kind of release. And then it seemed to kind of calm out there, and if people were talking about it, it went away, but it struck me really oddly.
Duncan.
Yeah, I think Tom's right. I think there's two aspects to that question though that's asked. One is about how have the restrictions impacted on the book and its use. Because lockdowns are different everywhere, it's going to have different impacts on the way it can be engaged with. I think what's really important is the book wasn't written during lockdown. The form wasn't invented during lockdown. It wasn't made for this. It happens, as Tom says, that if you are in a situation where you can go out and walk around and that's okay, then it's a really useful piece of work, because it's something you can engage with and do in that way. But it's not written for this moment, and I'm very wary of us trying to, with lots of different forms of media, try and work out how do we make them work in lockdown and COVID, because this isn't going to last forever, and we don't need to make everything work in a sort of new way. Luckily, this piece sort of works in a way that in some lockdown environments it'll be fine, but not in all of them. But that's also okay. I don't want to change it for that, because there'll be another time when it will be okay.
Yeah.
Well,
we're nearly out of time, but it seems to me that this last question here is actually quite a good final question for the three of you, which is from Emma Nuttall. What are the elements of this project which have left you with more questions, and why have they caught your attention? So maybe Nick, if we go to you on that, what are the questions that arise for you still from a project like this?
I mean, I've talked about the kind of theoretical stuff a little bit, so I think I'll leave that, because I think, you know, for me, it's about that pattern and presence, you know, and that sense of the mysterious all around us, the invisible mysterious. And just to say, I spent 5 minutes yesterday trying to persuade Tom that what would really be great would be if somehow, instead of people moving around in the world, you could produce a similar project where the world moved around people, and it would come to us in our lockdowns. And I mean, you know, Duncan and he, I think, are right now kind of sitting there going, no, not doing that. No, please don't make me do that. But I mean, so honestly, the question it leaves me with is, would I pursue another project in this mode if I could see a way of doing it that would produce something that was artistically satisfying? Because it's daunting because I don't have their skill set, but it's also compelling because I think the product is fascinating. Great,
thanks. Tom?
I can kind of answer it more because I've spent quite a lot of time with this over the last 2 or 3 months of kind of, you know, in the rebuild and working with Josh. For me, it's revisiting. It felt when we made the first version of this second edition back in 2015, we were trying to solve problems, and we were trying to fix things that we thought weren't what we wanted. And I think this time around, I felt much freer and much kind of fresher about the work. And I think what it's opened up for me is a set of conversations in my head at the moment, definitely about the relationship between digital and physical, in a way that I haven't had those conversations for a little while, but certainly about genre, about what can I do a haunted house piece? Can I do what happens, back to the first question, is what happens when we really try and engage with what presence is like in a rural environment? and those suddenly become, oh, I've got a, although Duncan and I kind of had a moment yesterday when it's not about the platform being repeatable, but there is a thing suddenly in there that I've got a mechanic I can play with. I've got a kind of mechanism, and that suddenly is really interesting, because there's something in my kind of writing brain that responds to, okay, what can we do that, because I know how this thing works, I can pull it apart, but I can make it work differently.
Duncan, what about, you're on the move there? Oh, no, you.
All interruptions, okay.
Final questions.
Yeah, working with fiction, like, it's just, for those that know my work, it's like I don't really work with fiction. I work with music, which is fictional to an extent, but generally it's always about just getting people to engage with what is there on the level that it's there. And in recent years, doing more work that's maybe more documentary in nature, bringing you stories from other places. But what was happened with this work was, it was kind of telling a fictional story. And so that's the thing that I would take away from it. I don't want to write a fictional story because I'm not very good at that. That's why I don't do it. So it would be about wanting to do this again with more writing by writers. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of our allotted time. So this conversation comes from you from the University of the West of England's Digital Cultures Research Centre, the DCRC. But Tom is planning a couple more events to follow up from this one, and the details of those will be released in the next couple of weeks. Is that correct, Tom?
That's the plan. Yeah. So just the middle one is quite sketchy, but we want to kind of take this conversation further, but a little bit dependent on where we got to today, as where different Nick and I kind of feel that it goes. But actually what Kate is being very humble about is we have a book coming out in the very start of 2021, which kind of it distills the brains that went into the ambient literature project and turns that into a book. So that's out from Macmillan, we hope before Christmas, but certainly right after Christmas. And that final event will be a kind of, at least at the moment, it's planned to be a kind of a look back at ambient literature specifically and where we take that, but also a book launch.
Great. Yeah. Well, then, just to finish by saying thank you to the three of you. Thanks, Nick Harkaway, Tom Abba, and Duncan Speakman. And thank you to all the invisible attendees who I hopefully have enjoyed our conversation. So have a good evening.